They believed they had everything they needed: probable cause, compliance, control. But according to a federal complaint, what they didn't realize was that every second of their decision-making was being documented, challenged, and ultimately turned against them in court. It starts like so many routine encounters do: a quiet afternoon, a parked car, a man sitting behind the wheel, waiting. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, but within minutes, that routine moment would spiral into an arrest, a legal battle, and a serious question about how far police authority really goes. The man at the center of this case is Daniel Reeves, 42 years old, no criminal record, a delivery contractor who had just finished a long shift and pulled into a public parking lot outside a small shopping plaza. According to later filings, he was sitting in his car responding to messages on his phone, preparing for his next job. From his perspective, nothing about the situation felt unusual. He wasn't speeding, he wasn't trespassing, he wasn't interacting with anyone. He was simply parked. But to the officers who would soon approach him, something about the scene raised suspicion. And that's where everything begins. Body cam footage shows a patrol vehicle slowly pulling into the lot. Two officers step out. They don't rush, they don't draw attention, but they move with purpose. One of them gestures toward Reeves' car. "Let's go talk to him." They approach from both sides. A light tap on the driver's window. Reeves looks up, slightly confused, and rolls it down halfway. "Hey, how's it going?" "Good. Is something wrong?" "Just checking in. We got a call about a suspicious vehicle in the area." Reeves nods slowly. "Okay, I'm just working. I'm a delivery driver." "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" And this is the moment where everything starts to shift. Reeves hesitates, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but cautiously. "Am I being detained?" The officer pauses. "Step out of the vehicle." "I'd like to know if I'm being detained." Now, this is important, because that one question, simple, direct, sets the tone for everything that follows. The officer's voice tightens. "Step out of the car." Reeves takes a breath. "I don't feel comfortable stepping out without knowing why." And just like that, the encounter begins to escalate. "Sir, step out of the vehicle now." "What did I do?" "You're refusing a lawful order." "I'm asking what the reason is." Within seconds, the second officer moves closer. The door opens. Reeves is pulled out of the vehicle. "Turn around, hands behind your back." "What is this for?" "You're being detained." Handcuffs click into place. And from that moment on, what started as a casual check-in becomes a full custodial situation. Now, before we go further, we need to pause here, because at this point, the legal question becomes very clear. What are officers actually allowed to do in a situation like this? In many jurisdictions, police are allowed to approach a parked vehicle and initiate what's called a consensual encounter. That means they can ask questions, check on the driver, and even request identification. But here's the key detail. Consensual means the person is free to leave. If a reasonable person would feel like they're not free to leave, then the encounter may no longer be consensual. Now, if officers want to detain someone, meaning temporarily restrict their movement, they generally need what's called reasonable suspicion. That's a specific, articulable reason to believe the person is involved in criminal activity. A vague report of a suspicious vehicle may or may not meet that standard. It depends on what details were provided. And then there's the issue of ordering someone out of a vehicle. In many states, during a lawful traffic stop, officers are allowed to order the driver out of the car for safety reasons. But this wasn't a traffic stop. Reeves was already parked. So a court would likely look at this and ask, was there a lawful basis to escalate from a conversation to a detention? Because once that line is crossed, the legal standards change. And that brings us back to the footage. Reeves is now in handcuffs, standing beside his car. "Why am I being detained?" he asks again. "You're being detained for investigation," the officer responds. Investigation of what? No clear answer. Instead, the officers begin searching his vehicle. And this is where things escalate even further. "Do you have anything illegal in the car?" "No." "Any weapons?" "No." Mind taking a look? I do mind. I don't consent to any searches. That statement is clear, direct, legally significant. But the search continues anyway. One officer opens the passenger door. Another starts going through the back seat. Reeves raises his voice slightly, not aggressively, but urgently. I said I don't consent to a search. You're being detained, the officer repeats. But what's the reason? No answer.
Now, this is where the second major legal issue comes into play: vehicle searches. Under the law, there are several ways officers can legally search a vehicle. They can obtain a warrant. They can rely on probable cause, meaning they have a reasonable belief that evidence of a crime is inside. They can conduct an inventory search if the vehicle was being impounded. But absent those conditions, consent becomes critical. And in this case, Reeves explicitly denied consent. So the question becomes, what was the legal justification for the search? If officers had probable cause, something specific, something observable, that could justify it. But if they didn't, then the search may cross into unconstitutional territory. And this is where officer discretion matters, because even when officers believe they're acting within their authority, the way that authority is exercised can have serious consequences. Back at the scene, the search turns up nothing. No contraband, no weapons, no evidence of any crime. But the situation doesn't de-escalate. Instead, one officer steps back and says, "You're being placed under arrest for obstruction." Reeves looks stunned. Obstruction? For what? For refusing to comply with lawful orders. I asked what the orders were for. Turn around. He's already in handcuffs, but now the situation has shifted from detention to arrest. And this is the moment that would later become the center of a lawsuit. Because obstruction charges often hinge on whether the underlying police action was lawful to begin with. If an officer gives a lawful order and someone intentionally interferes or refuses, that can sometimes lead to an obstruction charge. But if the order itself is not legally justified, then refusing it may not be a crime. And that's exactly what Reeves' legal team argued. According to the complaint, the officers lacked reasonable suspicion to detain him, lacked probable cause to search his vehicle, and then used an obstruction charge to justify an arrest that shouldn't have happened in the first place. After the arrest, Reeves was taken to the station, booked, and held for several hours before being released. Charges were formally filed, but weeks later, those charges were quietly dropped. No explanation, no public statement, just a dismissal. And that's when the situation shifted again, because Reeves didn't let it go. He filed a civil lawsuit alleging unlawful detention, illegal search, and wrongful arrest. The body cam footage was submitted as evidence, and when that footage became public, the reaction was immediate. Viewers pointed out the repeated questions, "Am I being detained?" and the lack of clear answers. They noted the refusal to explain the basis for the search, and they focused on the moment the obstruction charge was announced after the search turned up nothing. The department issued a brief statement saying the officers were conducting a lawful investigation and acted within policy. But the case didn't end there, because in civil court, the standard isn't just whether officers followed policy, it's whether constitutional rights were violated. And that brings us to accountability. Did the officers have legal authority to approach Reeves? Yes, most likely. Did they have the authority to ask questions? Again, yes. But did they have enough to detain him? That's less clear. Did they have probable cause to search the vehicle? That's even more questionable. And once those actions are in doubt, everything that follows, the arrest, the charges, the hours in custody, comes under scrutiny. Now, to be fair, officers often operate in uncertain conditions. They receive calls with limited information. They make decisions quickly, sometimes with incomplete context. And from their perspective, a person who refuses to comply can raise safety concerns. But here's the key distinction. Refusing to answer questions is not the same as committing a crime. Asking, "Am I being detained?" is not obstruction. And asserting your rights, calmly, clearly, is not by itself illegal. This is where the balance becomes critical, because the law gives officers authority, but it also sets limits. And when those limits are crossed, even with good intentions, the consequences can be serious. For Reeves, that meant being handcuffed, searched, arrested, and charged. For the officers, it meant facing a lawsuit that questioned every step they took. And for the public, it raises a broader issue. How many encounters like this happen every day without a camera? Because in this case, the footage tells a story of escalation, a story of unanswered questions, and a story of what can happen when authority is exercised without clear legal grounding. So, what can we take away from this? First, remain calm. Even when the situation feels unfair, staying composed can prevent things from escalating further. Second, understand that you have the right to ask questions. Am I being detained is not a challenge, it's a clarification. Third, know that you don't have to consent to searches, but also understand that refusing consent doesn't always stop a search in the moment. It simply preserves your rights for later. And finally, remember this. The roadside is not the place to win a legal argument. If something goes wrong, the courtroom is where that fight happens. Because as this case shows, what feels like a one-sided encounter in the moment can look very different when it's reviewed later, frame by frame, under the law. And sometimes the person who seemed to have no control in the moment ends up holding all the leverage in the end. So here's the question. Do you think this was lawful police work? Or did this officer take a routine situation way too far?